In a few hours, or perhaps in just a few minutes, you might walk into your kitchen, turn a metal handle, and fill a glass with clear, cold water. You will bring that glass to your lips and drink it without a second thought. You will not smell the water first to see if it carries the stench of a rotting carcass. You will not boil it to kill the microscopic organisms that might paralyze your bowels. You will not wonder if it contains the chemical runoff from a slaughterhouse, or if the water itself is going to kill you before the sun goes down.
What if that simple, invisible act, drinking a glass of tap water without fear, is an engineering miracle that was paid for in blood? What if the most powerful, wealthy, and vertically imposing city on Earth was almost completely abandoned because its residents were drinking their own waste? And what if the largest, most profitable bank in the United States today only exists because a calculating politician lied to a desperate population about building a water pipe to save dying children? This is the bizarre, brutal, and surprisingly deceptive history of how New York City learned to drink. If you had visited New York City at the end of the 18th century, the very first thing you would have noticed was not the architecture, nor the bustling harbor, nor the merchants in the streets. It was the smell. Manhattan is an island, tightly bordered by the massive Hudson River to the west and the East River to the east, both of which are tidal estuaries. They are filled with brackish salt water, entirely undrinkable. For the first 200 years of its existence as a European settlement, the people living in New York had only one major source of fresh drinking water. It was a 48-acre, 60-foot-deep spring-fed lake located in Lower Manhattan, originally called Couch Hook by the Dutch, but known to the English as the Collect Pond. Initially, the Collect was a pristine, crystal-clear body of water. Native Americans had relied on it for centuries, and early European settlers used it for fishing in the summer and ice skating in the winter. It was the absolute heart of the city's survival. But as the city grew, the land around the pond became the industrial center of New York. Because there were no zoning laws and no understanding of environmental preservation, the city's most noxious, foul, and toxic industries, the ones nobody wanted near their homes, were permitted to set up shop directly on the banks of the Collect. The tanneries arrived first. To process leather in the 1700s, tanners required massive amounts of water and highly caustic chemicals. They would soak animal hides in gigantic wooden vats filled with a mixture of lime, urine, and dog feces to break down the proteins and remove the hair. When they were done, the leftover toxic slurry was simply kicked into a ditch that drained straight into the pond. Then came the slaughterhouses. Butchers processing cattle and pigs would take the parts they couldn't sell, the offal, the hooves, the rotting entrails, the blood, and shovel it directly into the water. And then came the people. Because the city had absolutely no municipal sewer system, the rapidly expanding population of New York had to dispose of their human waste manually. Families would use chamber pots inside their homes. In the morning, they would carry these pots to the street and empty them into the gutters. When the heavy summer rains came, the water would wash all of that human excrement through the unpaved streets and deposit it directly into the lowest point on the island, the Collect Pond. By the late 1790s, the only major source of drinking water for a rapidly growing, globally important metropolis had transformed into a communal, bubbling, open sewer. The water drawn from the local wells, which tapped into the exact same groundwater table as the pond, became notoriously foul. Visitors to New York wrote letters back to Europe complaining that the city's water tasted like poison and smelled like a graveyard. Horses, entirely unbothered by human aesthetics but highly sensitive to toxins, routinely refused to drink it. Wealthy residents hired tea watermen, private vendors who would cart barrels of slightly less polluted water from a single pump on the outskirts of town, charging exorbitant prices by the bucket. But the vast majority of the city, the poor, the working class, the immigrants arriving in droves, had no other choice. They drank the water.
And they paid the price. In the summer of 1798, yellow fever swept through the narrow, crowded streets of New York. The mosquito-borne illness caused victims to develop a terrifying jaundice, their skin and eyes turning a ghastly yellow. They suffered soaring fevers, muscle spasms, and terrifying internal bleeding that led them to vomit coagulated black blood before their organs finally failed. In that single summer, the disease killed over 2,000 people, nearly 1/10 of New York's entire population. The wealthy fled to the countryside.
In the blistering heat, wooden carts rolled through the silent streets, the drivers calling out for families to bring out their dead. The physicians of the time did not understand germ theory. They had no idea that mosquitoes transmitted yellow fever or that bacteria caused intestinal diseases. They believed in the miasma theory, the idea that disease was caused by bad air rising from rotting matter. But they were not entirely blind. They looked at the festering, toxic soup of the Collect Pond and the surrounding slaughterhouses, and they realized it was a death trap. Dr.
Joseph Brown, a prominent local physician, published a frantic report declaring that the city's water supply was the source of the pestilence. The city was in a panic. It desperately needed a massive, publicly funded project to bring clean water from outside the city limits. And into this panic stepped a brilliant, calculating politician with a plan to save them all. His name was Aaron Burr. Yes, that Aaron Burr, the man who would, a few years later, stand on a dueling ground in New Jersey and shoot Alexander Hamilton in the chest. In 1799, Burr proposed the creation of a private company to save the city from disease. He called it the Manhattan Company. He promised the terrified public and the state legislature that his company would build an incredibly expensive, state-of-the-art aqueduct to pump clean, fresh water from the pristine Bronx River miles away, directly into the heart of New York City. The state legislature, still traumatized by the sight of the death carts from the yellow fever outbreak, rushed to approve Burr's charter, believing they were signing a public health mandate. But Aaron Burr had absolutely no interest in saving lives. He was playing a completely different, infinitely more lucrative game. At the time, the banking industry in New York was a strict monopoly controlled by the Federalist Party, specifically by Burr's bitter political rival, Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton had founded the Bank of New York and controlled the New York branch of the Bank of the United States. If you were a businessman aligned with Burr's Democratic-Republican Party, Hamilton's banks would simply refuse to give you a loan. Burr was desperate to start a rival bank, but he knew the Federalist-controlled legislature would never grant him a banking charter. So he weaponized the water crisis. When Burr drafted the charter for the Manhattan Company, he buried a stealth clause deep inside the legal text. He waited until the last possible moment of the legislative session, when lawmakers were exhausted and rushing to go home, to submit the bill. The clause, hidden among pages of engineering jargon, stated that if the water company had any surplus capital left over after building the water system, it could use those funds for the purchase of public or other stocks or in any other moneyed transactions or operations. It was a Trojan horse. Burr had tricked the government of New York. Once the charter was signed, Burr didn't build a massive aqueduct to the Bronx River. He didn't spend the millions required to import clean water. Instead, to keep up the legal appearance of being a water provider, he did the absolute bare minimum. He hired workers to dig up the streets and lay down a network of cheap, hollowed-out pine logs to act as wooden water pipes. And instead of piping in clean river water, he just sunk a few wells right next to the horrifically polluted Collect Pond, pumped the same toxic, disease-ridden water through the rotting wooden logs, and charged the desperate residents of the city for the privilege of drinking it. The Manhattan Company was a terrible, negligent water provider, but it was an incredibly successful bank. Shortly after its formation, Burr used his surplus capital to open an office of discount and deposit. He began issuing loans to his political allies, breaking Hamilton's financial monopoly. While the city continued to drink poison, Burr's bank grew into a massive financial empire. Over the next 2 centuries, through a series of complex mergers, the banking arm of the Manhattan Company evolved. In 1955, it merged with Chase National Bank to form the Chase Manhattan Bank, and in the year 2000, it merged with J.P. Morgan & Co. Today, it is known as J.P. Morgan Chase, the largest bank in the United States and one of the most powerful financial institutions in human history. If you walk down the street today and look at the iconic blue octagon logo of Chase Bank, the hollow white center is not just a random geometric design. It is widely recognized by financial historians as a stylized cross-section of Aaron Burr's wooden water pipes.
The biggest, most influential bank in America was born from a calculated scam that deliberately forced the residents of New York City to continue drinking contaminated water, while a politician got incredibly rich. If you are finding this hidden history fascinating, hit subscribe. There is more lost history like this waiting to be uncovered every single week. While Aaron Burr was building his banking empire, the physical reality of New York was collapsing. The city finally decided to deal with the stench of the collect pond, not by cleaning it, but by burying it.
Between 1802 and 1811, the city dug a massive drainage ditch, which would later be paved over and named Canal Street, and began filling the pond with dirt. They leveled a massive 110-foot hill called Bayard's Mount and dumped the soil, along with countless tons of garbage and debris, directly into the water until the pond vanished from the map. But it was an engineering disaster. The underground springs that had fed the pond for centuries were still flowing beneath the dirt. The buried vegetation and slaughterhouse waste trapped beneath the new landfill began to rot, releasing massive amounts of methane gas. The ground became a damp, unstable, mosquito-infested swamp. Because the land was sinking and smelled like sulfur, the wealthy residents abandoned the area. The newly created real estate became the cheapest in the city, and it quickly morphed into a neighborhood known as the 5 Points. It became the most notorious, overcrowded, and dangerous slum in American history, a place where extreme poverty, gang violence, and disease thrived on top of the rotting corpse of the city's original water supply. And then, in 1832, a new horror arrived to punish the city's hubris: cholera. Unlike yellow fever, cholera is directly waterborne, caused by bacteria swimming in contaminated drinking supplies.
It rips through the human intestinal tract, causing diarrhea so severe that victims can lose up to 10% of their body weight in a matter of hours, dying of catastrophic dehydration. Their skin would turn blue from lack of oxygen, as their blood thickened to the consistency of tar. Cholera devastated the 5 Points. It spread through the shallow wells and the wooden pipes of the Manhattan Company like a wildfire. Thousands died.
The city's wealthy elite, watching the mortality rates skyrocket, finally realized that if they didn't get clean water, New York would literally become uninhabitable. But it wasn't just disease that finally broke the city's resistance. It was fire. In the 1830s, New York was a city made of wood and brick, heated by open coal fires and lit by candles. Fires were a constant, terrifying threat. Because the city had no pressurized water system, firefighters had to rely on bucket brigades or pump water directly from the salty East River using hand-cranked engines. On the night of December 16, 1835, a fire broke out in a 5-story warehouse in the financial district. The conditions were apocalyptic. A massive winter storm had pushed temperatures down to an unthinkable 17 degrees below zero Fahrenheit. The winds were howling at gale force. When the volunteer firemen arrived, they found that the East River, their only source of water, had frozen completely solid. Desperate, the firemen used axes to chop massive holes through the ice, dropping their intake hoses into the freezing water below. But the air was so cold that the water instantly froze inside the leather hoses. The hand pumps jammed with ice. The water that managed to spray out of the nozzles blew backward in the gale force winds, freezing instantly onto the firemen's heavy wool coats. until they looked like terrifying ice sculptures. They were completely powerless. The firefighters could only stand and watch as the flames, fed by warehouses full of whale oil, imported silks, and dry goods, consumed the economic heart of the United States. The Great Fire of 1835 burned for 2 days.
It destroyed over 700 buildings, representing nearly 17 city blocks. The glow of the flames was so massive it could be seen from Philadelphia, 90 miles away. The destruction of the financial district, combined with the lingering terror of the cholera outbreaks, finally forced the hands of the politicians. They realized that without a massive, pressurized municipal water supply, the city would cease to exist. It would either die of dehydration, succumb to pestilence, or burn to ashes.
In 1837, the city embarked on one of the most ambitious, dangerous, and wildly expensive engineering projects undertaken since the fall of the Roman Empire, the Old Croton Aqueduct. They hired a brilliant chief engineer named John B. Jervis. Jervis knew that steam pumps were too unreliable to power a city of hundreds of thousands of people. He needed gravity. He looked 41 miles north of the city to the pristine Croton River in Westchester County. The plan was staggering. They would build a massive masonry dam across the river to create an enormous reservoir.
Then they would build a massive horseshoe-shaped tube made of brick and hydraulic cement, 8.5 feet high and 7.5 feet wide. This tube would run entirely underground, using a method called cut and cover, for 41 miles straight into the heart of Manhattan. To make the water flow purely by gravity, Jervis engineered the entire 41-mile aqueduct to slope downward at an incredibly precise angle of exactly 13 inches per mile. To build it, the city hired thousands of immigrant laborers, the vast majority of them Irishmen who had fled poverty and famine in Europe. They lived in squalid, temporary work camps along the route. Using nothing but pickaxes, black powder, and their bare hands, they blasted their way through solid granite hillsides. They dug trenches through swamps. When they reached the Harlem River, they built the High Bridge, a towering Roman-style stone viaduct featuring 15 massive arches that carried the water 114 feet in the air across the river gorge. The human cost was immense. The workers suffered from horrific blasting accidents, crushed by collapsing tunnel walls, and decimated by outbreaks of the same cholera they were building the aqueduct to escape. They worked 12 to 14-hour days in brutal conditions, building a lifeline for a city that most of them could barely afford to live in. After 5 years of relentless, back-breaking labor, the greatest public works project in American history was complete. On October 14, 1842, the Croton water finally arrived in Manhattan. The city erupted in a celebration unlike anything New York had ever seen in its history. Schools closed, businesses shuttered. A parade stretching 5 miles long marched through the streets. A massive, specially built fountain in City Hall Park was turned on, shooting a jet of crystal-clear, ice-cold water 50 feet into the air, powered by nothing but the immense gravity of water falling from 41 miles away. Church bells rang, cannons fired. People wept openly in the streets as they brought cups to the fountain and tasted clean, cold, pure water for the first time in their entire lives. The writer Edgar Allan Poe, who lived in New York at the time, marveled at the sheer scale of what human engineering had accomplished. The arrival of the Croton water changed everything instantly. The cholera outbreaks plummeted as the city was finally severed from its contaminated groundwater. The fire department, which previously had to watch the city burn helplessly, suddenly had hundreds of pressurized fire hydrants. They could hook up a hose and blast water onto a fire with enough pressure to shatter windows, stopping infernos before they could consume a single block. But the most profound, invisible consequence of the Croton Aqueduct was architectural. It completely rewrote the physical limits of the city. Before the aqueduct, living or working above the second or third floor of a building was a miserable experience. Because there was no water pressure, every single drop of water used for cooking, drinking, or washing had to be carried up the stairs by hand in heavy wooden buckets. The upper floors of buildings were reserved for the poorest residents or used as cheap storage, simply because the physical labor required to haul water up to them was exhausting. The pressurized gravity feed from the Croton system meant that water could suddenly push itself upward. It could automatically reach the upper floors of buildings without a single person carrying a bucket. It made the flush toilet practical. It made the indoor bathtub a reality. Without the Croton aqueduct, the skyscraper would have been physically impossible.
The iconic New York skyline, the towering residential blocks, the Empire State Building, the Chrysler Building, only exists because a team of engineers and thousands of immigrant laborers figured out how to push clean water uphill. New York transformed from a flat, pestilence-ridden, foul-smelling port town into a gleaming vertical metropolis, all because the city finally stopped drinking from a swamp. Today, New York City has one of the most complex, massive, and pure water systems on the entire planet.
It delivers over 1 billion gallons of water every single day, gravity-fed from pristine watersheds located over 100 miles away in the Catskill Mountains. The water is so clean, it doesn't even require mechanical filtration. But beneath the paved, modern streets of Lower Manhattan, when utility workers dig deep enough to repair a fiber optic cable or fix a modern steel pipe, they still occasionally strike something strange. They dig up the rotting, hollowed-out remains of 200-year-old pine logs.
They are the physical evidence of a time when clean water was a political lie, when disease was an accepted reality, and when the foundation of modern global finance was built directly on the thirst of a dying city. Tonight, when you turn on your tap, the water will flow effortlessly. You will not think about the 41 miles of masonry buried underground. You will not think about the thousands of Irish laborers who blasted through solid bedrock. You will not think about the families who died drinking the black water of the collect pond, or the politicians who made millions while they suffered.
But every single drop that fills your glass is a triumph over a brutal history. It is a staggering luxury built by people whose names we forgot, solving a problem we no longer have to fear. If this story changed how you look at the simplest things in your own home, subscribe to the channel. There are more hidden worlds waiting to be uncovered. Click the video on screen to see what else history left behind.